It's week 37 in the Bible Challenge, and we're continuing in the prophet Jeremiah, beginning at page 31. We will finish the letter to the Hebrews this week, and we will go through all of the letter to James, or the letter of James, I should say. Psalms 57 through 62 will be encountered for the second time this week, and if you want to go back through the outline teachings on Psalms 57 through 62, please refer back to our Bible study summaries for weeks 10 and 11 of the Bible Challenge. But here we are, and we are in chapter 31 now of Jeremiah. This begins with an oracle of the restoration of Israel. As we pointed out in chapter 30 last week, the high point kind of the whole theme of Jeremiah and of prophetic literature, if we really want to generalize, is of salvation after judgment. So here we have immediately now in chapter 31 an oracle of the restoration of Israel, with the process to begin in the north, which of course was the kingdom which first fell. The triumphal march of exiles referred to here, returning through the desert, is a cause of great joy, to be a cause of great joy, both to the repatriates and to foreigners. The theme is one of new exodus. The captives return from Assyria, described in verse 8 here as the north country. The northern kingdom is personified in Rachel, harking back to references at Genesis 30:24 and 35:16. It is in this context of return and of the then novel idea of personal as opposed to collective responsibility that we see the prophet speak of a new covenant. Now, first we see this idea of personal responsibility at 31, verse 29-30. Remember, we've basically been dealing with an era of collective culpability, corporate responsibility, corporate sin. All the people get punished for corporate sin. So when the prophet speaks of individual responsibility here and a new covenant at 31, verses 31 to 34, we have a justly famous passage of the new covenant being written on the hearts as opposed to stone. This personalizes it and internalizes it. Yes, we are still identified through the covenant externally in the covenanted people, just as we are now under the new covenant in the worshiping community, the assembly, the church. But it is not just external in the old covenant or in the new. It becomes personal. It becomes a personal response to God's call. The heart as writing material here is a creation of Jeremiah. We can compare chapter 17, verse 1, but we can also look at things like Deuteronomy 6:6, 11:18, and 30:14 to see where Jeremiah had some background thinking going on here. In chapters 32 to 33, we have reference to the restoration of Judah, the southern kingdom. This oracle is centered on events in the prophet's life as an example of acted out prophecy. So, for example, the prophet purchases land that is under occupation as an oracle of future restoration of the land. And here's where we get the first mention, actually, of Baruch as a person. Baruch as the prophet's friend and secretary. We get three incidents related in chapters 34 to 35 from Baruch's memoirs as the conclusion of the description of the restoration. The prophet speaks here of the conditions necessary for restoration. The balance of the readings we will encounter this week, chapters 36 through 45, are really one homogeneous narrative of the martyrdom of the prophet Jeremiah. Where his prophecy had once been recognized and even vindicated, he is now progressively rejected. And this progression includes the reading of a scroll of the prophet's oracles in the temple, chapter 36, the scroll containing oracles against Jerusalem and of the downfall of Babylon, the encounters between Jeremiah and King Zedekiah in chapter 37. This includes Jeremiah being imprisoned naked in a cistern or well. Then we get the fall of Jerusalem in chapters 38 and 39, and the prophet after the fall in chapters 40 and 41. Pilgrims from the old cultic centers in the north come to the ruins of the temple. It's been destroyed by Babylon. They come to the ruins of the temple to present offerings, and they're slaughtered. So mourning rites continue throughout the exile in the ruins of Jerusalem and of the temple. And we see this also in the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, and in Isaiah, chapters 63 and 64. Now, the prophet warns the people not to flee to Egypt. Egypt would be the natural counterbalance here to Babylon. This is like you're Poland and you're between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. To whom do you turn? Do you turn to the Germans? Do you turn to the Russians? Well, that didn't work out well in World War II, and the prophet is saying the same thing here. Egypt is not going to save you. Do not flee to Egypt. Babylon will just view this as a rebellion and further crush you. The prophet, having warned against fleeing, is forcibly carried away. And there, from Egypt, he issues an oracle against the nations and denounces the persistent idolatry of the people. So at this point this week, we're in a pretty bad place in the history of the Jewish people and in the history of the prophet Jeremiah. We will wrap up his prophecies next week. We really kind of wrapped up Hebrews last week, noting that we were to the point of final exhortation, but we are here in chapter 13, one of exhortations, blessings, and greetings. We can compare Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 to 8, for sort of a prefiguring of what is described here, that there are exhortations to purity of life, that the former leaders in the community whose faith is to be imitated have died, but Jesus Christ remains high priest forever. The reference here to not being led astray by foods, verse 9, these references are not really clear, but most likely refer to ascetical practices that may have been early intimations of Gnosticism. Gnostic practices generally would sit there and say that the body, the material world, these are bad things, and therefore we have to mortify our flesh and starve ourselves. This is a healthy tonic, in effect, saying, no, our bodies have been given to us as gifts by God, that the material world is good as God looked upon his creation and pronounced it very good. And so let's not worry about, starving ourselves. The following references to being inside and outside the tent, the tabernacle, can be considered as basically a polemic against the temptations to return to the temple cult, to return to temple worship. We get the only explicit reference to resurrection in Hebrews at Hebrews 13:20. And then the letter basically ends on that note, which takes us to the letter of James. Now, which James are we talking about here? Almost universally, throughout the history of the church, this letter has been assigned to James, the brother of the Lord, the head of the church in Jerusalem. There is a small minority of scholars who have believed the letter to be written by James, the son of Alphaeus, but it is a minority. And regardless whether we're talking about James, the brother of the Lord, or James, the son of Alphaeus, we know we're talking about a letter of apostolic origin. That has never been questioned. The letter is dated to about the 6th decade of the 1st century, about 30 years after the death of Jesus, roughly contemporaneous with the writing of the Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel written. The entire letter is essentially a sermon, a series of exhortations. James here represents the Jewish church in Jerusalem in distinction from the Gentile or Greek church which has arisen out of the mission work of Peter, and then particularly from the mission efforts of Paul and Barnabas. James, unlike Paul, makes no distinction between law and gospel. He speaks of the perfect law of liberty and equates law with the Word of God. This is a parallel to the concept of law set forth by Jesus himself at Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, where he makes clear that he is the fulfillment of the law. To label James as a legalist, however, would be very misguided. His focus on law is as a focus on conduct for the common good, of a lively faith being expressed in and by acts. Now, James is written as a sermon, as I said, a long series of exhortations, but most of the exhortations themselves are pretty brief, and they're not necessarily connected thematically, and so there are parts of James that are written in a style parallel to the wisdom literature that we encountered earlier in books like Proverbs and certainly in the Psalms, or in Ecclesiastes, or in the Wisdom of Solomon. This is that Jewish wisdom tradition that the Jewish church in Jerusalem is amplifying upon. But notwithstanding this loose organization, the letter is connected by the common emphases that the faith of its recipients the common emphasis that the faith of the letter's recipients is not theoretical or abstract, but is a faith translated into action, implemented in every part of the believers' lives. The recipients of the letter would seem to be a group of Jewish Christian communities outside of Palestine, but living in an area where James, that is the Church of Jerusalem, would have had authority. The letter likely dates from the 6th decade of the 1st century, after Paul's teaching on faith and works, but before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. So actually that's the 7th decade. If this dating is correct, the letter was probably written from Jerusalem. If a later date is allowed for James, and that would be a minority view, then the letter may have been written from Antioch or from Alexandria. We can outline the letter, and that's what we're going to do this week as we go through all the letter, by looking first at greeting and opening exhortation, then that believers may experience joy in suffering, believers must not waver in praying for wisdom, the attitude of the lowly and the rich are contrasted, those who trust in the Lord and those who trust in their own resources. Endurance produces triumph, and the origins of sin and death are discussed. We speak very much here of an active faith, doers of the word, not just listeners of the word. We see the dangers of partiality being recited. Don't just defer to the powerful. We get examples and arguments given here. We get the admonition that faith without works is dead. In other words, show me your works and I will illustrate what your faith is, and vice versa. We get a thesis and argument with examples around that. The dangers of intemperate speech. This is very community focused in chapter 3, how we are to build each other up in what we say as well as in what we do. Qualities of wisdom and how this is exercised in community, which leads us right into the causes of strife in community, chapter 4, and what the remedies for this strife may be. Boasting about tomorrow is seen as vain. We are to rely on God's plan, not on our own. We get warnings to the rich if they are acting in an oppressive manner, and we get the admonition to all of us to await the coming of the Lord with patience, that this will happen on God's good time, not on our own schedule. Finally, the letter ends with a prayer of faith and a prayer for reliance upon faith. Very much a sermon here, not a classical three-point sermon, but one in which James is speaking in a very pastoral role to new believers who are being challenged every day of their lives. May this letter and all of God's holy word speak to us each day as we face the challenges of our own lives and the life of the church together. This we pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen.